The search party found the cabin first, what was left of it. The roof had caved in under 18 feet of snow, collapsing the walls inward, crushing everything inside into a frozen mass of splintered logs and shattered belongings. They dug for 3 hours looking for Samuel Pickett's body, certain the trapper had died like the others. 7 men frozen in the Colorado Rockies during the worst blizzard in 30 years. They didn't find a body. They found boot prints leading away from the wreckage, already half filled with blown snow, heading toward the massive, uprooted pine that had fallen during the October windstorm. The root ball of that fallen giant stood 15 feet tall, a wall of frozen earth and tangled roots that had torn a crater in the mountainside when the tree toppled. Behind that root ball, they found Samuel Pickett, alive, sitting by a small fire in a shelter carved into the earth beneath the roots, wrapped in furs, drinking coffee from a tin cup. The temperature outside was 23 below zero, inside his root shelter, protected by the massive tangle of roots and packed earth. It was warm enough that Samuel had removed his heavy coat. "You boys look cold," Samuel said, not getting up. "Coffee's hot if you want some." The search party stood in stunned silence. 7 men had frozen to death in cabins within 15 miles of this spot. Samuel Pickett had survived in a hole dug under a fallen tree. No cabin, no proper shelter, just roots and earth and knowledge that the other trappers had dismissed as old-timer nonsense when Samuel tried to share it. The shelter that saved his life wasn't something Samuel invented during the emergency. He'd built it 3 months earlier, in September, when the other trappers mocked him for wasting time on what they called a dirt burrow. When he had a perfectly good cabin, they'd laughed at the old mountain man playing in the mud like a badger. Then the blizzard came, and Samuel's dirt burrow was the only shelter in the territory that didn't fail. Samuel Pickett was 61 years old in the autumn of 1879, which made him ancient by Rocky Mountain standards. Most trappers didn't survive past 45, killed by accidents, weather, animals, or the accumulated toll of brutal living conditions. Samuel had been trapping since 1842, when he was 24 years old, 37 years in the mountains, 37 winters survived. That kind of longevity meant he knew things younger trappers had never learned. One of those things was the value of backup shelter. Samuel had seen too many men die when their primary shelter failed. Cabin fires, roof collapses, structural failures from extreme cold, flash floods, avalanches. A man with only one shelter was a man one disaster away from death. So every autumn, wherever Samuel established his winter camp, he built a backup shelter, something hidden, something simple, something that couldn't fail because there was almost nothing to fail. Over the decades, he'd refined his technique until it required minimal effort but provided maximum security. The fallen pine tree on his 1879 claim was perfect for what Samuel had in mind. The tree had toppled during a windstorm 3 years earlier, tearing out of the mountainside and leaving a massive root ball exposed. The root ball was 15 feet in diameter, a tangled mass of roots, rocks, and frozen earth standing nearly vertical where the tree had pivoted as it fell. Behind the root ball, where the roots had torn free, was a natural depression in the earth, a crater about 8 feet deep and 12 feet across. Samuel looked at that crater and saw shelter. The other trappers looked at it and saw a hole in the ground. His nearest neighbor was a younger trapper named James Harlan, 32 years old, experienced enough to be confident but not experienced enough to be humble. Harlan had built a solid cabin about a mile from Samuel's claim, and he'd watched with amusement as Samuel spent 3 weeks in September working on his underground project. "What exactly are you building, old man?" Harlan asked one afternoon, riding over to observe. "Backup shelter," Samuel replied, not pausing in his digging. "Backup? You've got a cabin. Why do you need backup?" "Cabin can fail. This won't fail. It's a hole in the ground, under a dead tree. How is that better than a cabin?" Samuel straightened from his work. "Cabin has roof that can collapse. This shelter is underground. Snow weight doesn't matter. Cabin has walls that can burn. This shelter is earth, can't burn. Cabin has chinking that can fail. This shelter is solid earth, no gaps. Cabin requires constant fire to stay warm. This shelter uses earth temperature and root insulation." Harlan laughed. "Earth temperature? It's frozen ground. How does frozen ground keep you warm?" "Ground freezes on surface. Below frost line, ground is warmer than air in winter. Not warm, but warmer. This shelter will be below frost line, protected by roots and earth. Will be 30 degrees warmer than surface temperature without any fire. 30 degrees warmer than surface? So if it's 20 below outside, your hole in the ground will be 10 above? Approximately, yeah. Possibly warmer with insulation improvements. That's still freezing. You'd still need fire. Small fire only, very small. This shelter will need 1/10 the wood of cabin for same comfort level. Harlan shook his head. I think you've gone crazy in your old age, Samuel. Digging a burrow like an animal. Living men build cabins. This is something a crazy person does. Living men survive, Samuel replied. Dead men followed traditions that didn't work. Harlan rode away laughing. The story spread to other trappers in the area. Old Samuel Pickett had lost his mind, spending weeks building a hole in the ground instead of reinforcing his cabin. The old man was digging himself a grave and calling it shelter. Someone should check on him come spring to see if he'd survived his own stupidity. Samuel had learned the technique from a Ute elder in 1851, 28 years earlier. The Ute people had used root shelters for thousands of years, not as primary homes but as emergency shelter, hunting camps, and backup protection when caught in unexpected weather. The technique was simple but specific. A fallen tree with an intact root ball was ideal. The root ball provided structural support, a natural wall that wouldn't collapse. The crater left behind when roots tore free provided a natural depression to work with. The tangled roots created a framework for additional construction, and the mass of earth still clinging to the roots provided insulation. Samuel began by enlarging the natural crater behind the root ball. He dug downward and outward, creating a chamber about 10 feet wide, 12 feet long, and 7 feet deep at the lowest point. The digging was hard work. Frozen surface soil gave way to softer earth below, but there were rocks to move, roots to cut, and debris to clear. The depth was critical. Samuel knew from experience that ground temperature stabilized at about 50 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit below the frost line in this region. The frost line was typically 3 to 4 feet deep. By digging to 7 feet, he was well below where ground would freeze even in the coldest weather. The earth walls of his shelter would maintain temperature regardless of surface conditions. The root ball formed the back wall of his shelter, or more accurately, the roof over the back section. The massive tangle of roots, still holding tons of earth, extended out over part of his excavated space. Samuel reinforced this natural roof by weaving additional branches through the root structure and packing earth on top. The front of the shelter, the part not protected by the root ball, required constructed roofing. Samuel cut poles from nearby pine trees, selecting straight pieces about 4 inches in diameter. He laid these poles from the exposed edge of the root ball forward, creating a sloped roof that extended the shelter outward. The poles rested on the root ball at one end, and on a low log wall he built at the front at the other end. This log wall was only about 3 feet high, not a full cabin wall, just enough to support the roof poles and provide some wind protection. Samuel notched the logs at the corners, frontier style, but kept the construction minimal. The wall wasn't meant to be structural, the earth would provide structure. Over the roof poles, Samuel laid smaller branches, creating a lattice that would hold insulation. Over the branches, he spread a thick layer of pine boughs, perhaps 18 inches deep. Over the pine boughs, he spread earth, at least 2 feet of soil excavated from his digging. Finally, over the earth, he placed more pine boughs and loose brush. The total roof thickness was nearly 4 feet. Poles, branches, pine boughs, earth, and more boughs. This massive roof wouldn't collapse under snow because snow load would simply compact the earth layer and add insulation. Unlike a cabin roof with its rigid structure that could fail under extreme weight, Samuel's earth roof was essentially a controlled dirt pile that became stronger as weight increased. The entrance was carefully designed. Samuel didn't create a door in the front wall. Instead, he dug a tunnel that entered from the side, angling downward before curving into the main chamber. This entrance tunnel was about 4 feet long and required crawling to navigate. The tunnel served multiple purposes. It prevented wind from blowing directly into the shelter. It created a cold trap where dense cold air would settle rather than entering the main chamber, and it was small enough to block easily with a bundle of branches if needed. Inside the shelter, Samuel created a raised sleeping platform along one side, packed earth covered with pine boughs and firs. The platform was about 18 inches above the floor level, keeping him in the warmer air layer near the ceiling. The floor itself he left left as packed earth, with a small depression in the center for fire if needed. Ventilation came through a small hole in the roof near the back, positioned where the root ball provided natural channels through the tangled roots. This hole was only about 3 inches in diameter, enough for air exchange but small enough to minimize heat loss. Samuel created a removable plug from a bundle of moss and grass that could seal the hole if needed. The entire construction process took Samuel 3 weeks of steady work. When finished, the shelter was nearly invisible. From the outside, you'd see a fallen tree with its root ball exposed, and behind it, what looked like a mound of disturbed earth and brush. You'd never know there was a room underneath large enough to house a man comfortably. Word of Samuel's underground shelter spread through the trapper community. In late September, a group of 4 trappers rode out specifically to see what the old man had built. James Harlan led them, still amused by Samuel's burrow. The group stood at the entrance, looking at what appeared to be a brush-covered mound with a dark hole at one end. "This is your backup shelter?" asked a trapper named Wilson. "A hole in the ground covered with sticks?" "Is more than sticks," Samuel replied. "Is 4 feet of insulation, earth, branches, pine boughs. Will stay warm when your cabins are freezing." "My cabin won't be freezing. My cabin has a proper fireplace, proper roof, proper walls. Proper roof that can collapse, proper walls that can crack, proper fireplace that requires constant wood," Wilson laughed. "And your dirt pile is better?" "In extreme conditions, yes. Cabin is adequate for normal winter. This shelter is for when normal fails." Another trapper, Thomas Reed, crawled into the entrance tunnel out of curiosity. He emerged a moment later looking surprised. "It's actually warm in there," Reed admitted. "Warmer than outside by a lot." "Ground temperature," Samuel explained. 7 feet down. Ground is 52 degrees year-round. Add body heat and small fire, shelter will be 65, 70 degrees. "But you're living like an animal, crawling into a hole. How is that civilized?" "Civilized is staying alive. Dead men don't care about civilization." Harlan shook his head. "Samuel, I've got to be honest with you. This is sad. You've been in these mountains too long. You're thinking like a savage instead of a white man. We build cabins because that's what civilized people do. We don't dig burrows like badgers." "Badgers survive," Samuel said quietly. "Every winter, badgers survive. How many trappers you know who didn't?" The question hung in the air. Every man present had lost friends to winter. Frozen in cabins, killed in fires, crushed by roof collapses. The mortality rate among mountain men was brutal, but none of them were willing to admit the old man might have a point. They rode away still laughing, telling each other stories about crazy old Samuel and his underground hideout. The story would be good for entertainment at the trading post. Samuel spent October preparing for winter as he always did, cutting firewood, setting trap lines, preserving meat, making repairs to his cabin. But he also spent time improving his root shelter, adding touches that would make extended occupancy comfortable. He lined the sleeping platform with thick layers of pine boughs covered with buffalo hides and wool blankets. He built a small stone fire ring in the center depression, surrounding it with flat rocks that would absorb and radiate heat. He stocked the shelter with emergency supplies, dried meat, hardtack, coffee, salt, ammunition, and several wool blankets beyond what was on the bed. He cut a substantial pile of firewood and stacked it just outside the shelter entrance, small pieces because the shelter would only need small fires. He positioned everything so he could reach the wood pile without fully exiting the shelter. In late October, Samuel decided to test his shelter during a cold snap. Temperature had dropped to 5 below zero overnight. Cold, but not extreme. He spent 3 nights in the root shelter instead of his cabin. The results exceeded his expectations. Without any fire at all, the shelter maintained approximately 48 degrees, the earth walls radiating their stable temperature into the enclosed space. When he burned a small fire for an hour in the evening, using perhaps 2 pounds of wood, interior temperature rose to 68 degrees. It remained above 55 degrees until morning. His cabin, by comparison, required constant fire to maintain similar temperatures, and dropped to near exterior temperature within 2 hours of the fire dying. Samuel calculated his fuel efficiency. His cabin used approximately 50 pounds of wood per day in moderate cold, more in extreme cold. His root shelter used approximately 5 pounds per day for the same comfort level. The shelter was 10 times more efficient. He shared these results with James Harlan when they crossed paths at the trading post in late October. Harlan was unimpressed. "You spent 3 nights in a hole in the ground. Congratulations. I spent 3 nights in my cabin, in a bed." like a human being. Your cabin used 50 pounds of wood per night. My shelter used 2 pounds. Wood's not scarce here. I can cut all I need. Until you can't. Until injury. Until sickness. Until weather so bad you can't leave. Then efficiency matters. I'll take my chances with the cabin. You enjoy your burrow. Neither man could have known that in 7 weeks, the worst blizzard in 3 decades would put their different approaches to the ultimate test. November brought early snow and increasingly harsh temperatures. The first major storm hit on November 8th, dropping 2 feet of snow in 24 hours. Temperature dropped to 18 below. The trappers in the area hunkered down in their cabins, burning wood steadily, waiting for the weather to break. Samuel noticed something concerning during the November 8th storm. His cabin roof was sagging slightly under the snow load. The structure was 15 years old, built by a previous occupant, and the ridgepole showed signs of stress. Samuel cleared the snow from the roof, but the underlying weakness worried him. He mentioned this to Harlan when they met to discuss trapline boundaries. Your cabin roof solid? Solid as stone? Why? Mine's showing stress. Old construction. Ridgepole might be compromised. You should reinforce it then. I will, but if it fails, I have backup. Your dirt burrow. My survival. The second November storm hit on November 19th. 3 feet of snow in 36 hours. Samuel cleared his roof again, noticing the sag had worsened. He could hear the ridgepole creaking during the storm. Not a good sign. He spent November 20th and 21st inside his root shelter as a precaution, returning to the cabin when weather calmed. A trapper named Morrison stopped by on November 24th. He'd heard about Samuel's shelter and wanted to see it, though his tone suggested skepticism rather than genuine interest. So this is the famous burrow, Morrison said, peering into the entrance tunnel. Want to see inside? Morrison crawled through the tunnel and spent several minutes in the main chamber. When he emerged, his expression had changed. It's actually comfortable in there. I didn't expect that. Earth temperature and good insulation, simple physics. Why don't more people build these? Because it looks primitive. Because it requires crawling. Because men don't want to admit that underground shelter is sometimes superior to cabins. You think something bad is coming? Samuel looked at the sky. Heavy, low clouds, the kind that preceded major weather. I think something is always coming. Question is whether you're prepared when it arrives. Morrison rode away thoughtful rather than laughing. He was the first person Samuel had shown who seemed to take the concept seriously. The storm that would kill 7 men and destroy multiple cabins began on December 12, 1879. It didn't start dramatically, just snow, steady and heavy, driven by moderate wind. But it didn't stop. By December 13th, 18 inches had accumulated. By December 14th, 3 feet. By December 15th, 5 feet, and the temperature had dropped to 15 below. Still the snow fell. Still the wind drove it into drifts that climbed cabin walls and pressed against roofs with increasing weight. Samuel cleared his cabin roof on December 13th, and again on December 14th. On December 15th, the task became impossible. The snow was falling faster than he could remove it, and the wind was creating drifts that reformed within hours. He made a decision. He would move to the root shelter preemptively before the cabin roof failed. He gathered supplies, all his remaining food, his best furs, his ammunition, his coffee, his tools, and hauled them to the root shelter in multiple trips. The travel was exhausting, just 1 mile round trip through waist-deep snow, but by evening on December 15th, everything essential was underground. That night, sleeping in his root shelter while the storm raged above, Samuel heard his cabin roof collapse. The sound was unmistakable, a sharp crack followed by a prolonged crashing and settling. He couldn't see it in the darkness and snow, but he knew his cabin was destroyed. He was underground, warm, with supplies to last weeks. The disaster that would have killed him had merely destroyed an empty building. The storm continued through December 16th, 17th, 18th. Snow accumulated to depths that made travel impossible. Temperature dropped to 25 below, then 30 below. Samuel stayed in his root shelter, venturing out only briefly to check conditions and retrieve firewood from his stacked supply. Interior temperature remained stable, 55 degrees without fire, 65 to 70 degrees with his small evening fire. He used approximately 3 pounds of wood per day, sustainable indefinitely from his stockpile. He was comfortable, fed, and in no danger. He thought about the other trappers in the area. Harlan's cabin was solid but new. It might hold. Morrison's cabin was older, similar to Samuel's. Wilson, Reed, and the others were scattered across the territory in structures of varying quality. Some would make it, some wouldn't. December 19th brought the storm's peak intensity. Wind increased to hurricane force, driving snow horizontally, creating whiteout conditions where you couldn't see your hand at arm's length. Temperature bottomed at 36 below zero, the coldest Samuel had experienced in 37 years of mountain winters. The wind destroyed structures that snow load hadn't already damaged. Cabin doors blew in, roof sections tore away. Men who'd been barely surviving in compromised cabins suddenly faced full exposure to killing conditions. Samuel stayed underground. His shelter was invisible to the wind. The root ball and earth mound simply didn't present a profile that wind could attack. Snow accumulated on top, adding insulation, but the structure beneath was unaffected. The entrance tunnel stayed clear because it faced away from the prevailing wind, sheltered by the root ball mass. Interior temperature dropped slightly as exterior temperature fell. The extreme cold was penetrating deeper than normal, but the shelter still maintained 48 degrees without fire, and Samuel's small evening fire brought it back to 60 degrees. He was uncomfortable but safe. He thought about what was happening in cabins across the territory. Men huddling next to fireplaces, burning through wood supplies, watching their structures fail, dying alone in the white hell outside. There was nothing he could do to help them. Travel was suicide. He could only survive and hope others were doing the same. The peak lasted 18 hours. By morning on December 20th, the wind had dropped, though snow continued falling. Samuel estimated total accumulation at between 15 and 18 feet, unprecedented in his experience, enough to bury single-story cabins completely. On December 21st, the storm finally broke. Snow stopped, wind calmed, and weak winter sun filtered through thinning clouds. Samuel emerged from his shelter for the first time in 6 days to assess conditions. The landscape was unrecognizable. Snow had transformed everything, filling valleys, burying structures, smoothing the terrain into gentle white curves. His cabin was invisible, buried under a drift that extended 20 feet beyond where the walls had stood. The collapsed structure was entombed under tons of frozen water. Samuel spent the day digging out his firewood supply and checking his trap lines near the shelter. Travel beyond a few hundred yards was impossible. The snow was too deep, too soft, requiring snowshoes he'd have to fashion before attempting longer distances. On December 22nd, he made snowshoes from bent willow branches and strips of hide. On December 23rd, he attempted travel toward Harlan's cabin, a mile to the east. He found the cabin destroyed. The roof had collapsed under snow load, and the subsequent wind had scattered debris across the buried clearing. He dug for 2 hours, finding remains of Harlan's belongings but no body. Had Harlan escaped? Was he sheltering somewhere else? Or was he buried deeper than Samuel could dig? Samuel marked the location and continued searching. Over the next 4 days, he checked every cabin within traveling distance. The destruction was comprehensive. Harlan's cabin collapsed. No body found. Morrison's cabin collapsed. Morrison found dead inside. Frozen. Wilson's cabin partially collapsed. Wilson found dead, apparently killed by falling roof timber. Reed's cabin destroyed by wind. Reed's body found 50 yards away, apparently died trying to reach neighboring cabin. Peterson's cabin completely buried. 2 bodies found inside. Peterson and his partner, names unknown. Martin's cabin burned. Apparently fire got out of control. Martin's body found nearby. Taylor's cabin intact, but Taylor found dead inside from apparent hypothermia. Fire had gone out. 7 dead. 7 men who'd trusted their cabins to protect them. 7 men who'd mocked Samuel's underground shelter as primitive and foolish. On December 27th, a search party from the trading post reached Samuel's area. They'd been working outward from the settlement for 3 days, checking on trappers, counting survivors and casualties. They expected to find Samuel dead. His cabin was one of the oldest in the territory, and he was one of the oldest trappers. If anyone had died in the storm, it would be the old man in the old cabin. They found his cabin first, the collapsed mass of timber and snow. They began digging, expecting to recover a body. 3 hours of work revealed found only wreckage, no Samuel. Then they noticed tracks, snowshoe prints leading away from the cabin site toward the massive, uprooted pine tree. The root ball was visible above the snow, a dark tangle against the white landscape. They followed the tracks. Behind the root ball, they found Samuel, alive, sitting by a small fire in his underground shelter, comfortable, warm, drinking coffee. He'd survived 6 days of the worst storm in 30 years in a hole in the ground. The search party stood stunned. 3 of them had known Samuel for years, had heard about his crazy underground shelter, had laughed at the old man's eccentricity. Now they were looking at the only trapper in the territory who'd come through the storm unscathed. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost," Samuel said. "We thought you were dead," one of the rescuers replied. "Your cabin's destroyed." "Knew it would be. Ridgepole was compromised. That's why I built this. This saved your life." That was the idea. They crowded into the shelter, 5 men plus Samuel, tight but manageable. Interior temperature was 62 degrees despite the crowding. Several men removed their coats, warm for the first time in days. "How is it this warm?" one asked. "Earth temperature, 7 feet down. Ground is 52 degrees year-round. Add body heat, add small fire, temperature rises. This shelter maintains itself, doesn't fight the cold, uses it." "How much wood have you burned?" "Maybe 20 pounds total in 2 weeks. Cabin would have used 500 pounds if it had survived." The men exchanged glances. They'd all burned through enormous amounts of wood during the storm, some nearly depleting their supplies. Samuel had used 20 pounds, a single day's supply for a cabin, to survive 2 weeks. "Will you teach us to build these?" the search party leader asked. "We'll teach anyone who wants to learn. Technique is old, learned it from Ute people. 30 years ago, works every time." The search party continued their work over the following days, with Samuel's shelter serving as a base of operations. The final casualty count was grim. James Harlan, body found on December 29th, buried under cabin debris, apparently killed by initial roof collapse. George Morrison, found December 23rd by Samuel, frozen inside collapsed cabin. Thomas Wilson, found December 24th by Samuel, killed by falling timber. Robert Reed, found December 24th by Samuel, frozen while attempting to travel. John Peterson, found December 25th by Samuel, frozen inside collapsed cabin. William Moore, Peterson's partner, found December 25th by Samuel, frozen inside collapsed cabin. James Martin, found December 24th by Samuel, died in cabin fire. Benjamin Taylor, found December 26th by Samuel, frozen inside intact cabin when fire went out. 8 dead in the immediate area. Additional deaths were reported from other parts of the territory. The final toll exceeded 30 trappers and settlers across the Colorado Rockies. It was the deadliest storm in the region's recorded history. Every death occurred in an above-ground cabin. Every cabin in the affected area was either destroyed or severely damaged. The only structure that survived intact was Samuel's underground root shelter, the dirt burrow that everyone had mocked. Samuel spent January teaching root shelter construction to surviving trappers and to newcomers arriving from the trading post. Interest was intense. The deaths had shaken the trapping community's confidence in conventional cabin construction. The technique was straightforward but specific. Site selection. Ideal sites included fallen trees with intact root balls, natural earth banks, steep hillsides with stable soil. The key requirement was a vertical or near-vertical earth face that could form one wall of the shelter, reducing excavation work. Excavation. Dig a chamber 7 feet deep, below frost line, 10 to 12 feet wide, and as long as needed for the number of occupants. Earth walls should be smooth and stable. In rocky soil, work around large rocks rather than trying to remove them. They add thermal mass. Roof structure. If using a root ball, the natural root tangle forms part of the roof. Extend the shelter beyond the root ball using poles, branches, and earth. Minimum roof thickness should be 3 feet, 4 feet preferred. Include poles strong enough to support the earth load plus additional snow accumulation. Insulation layers. From bottom up, poles, smaller branches or bark sheets to hold debris, pine boughs or other vegetation, 18 inches minimum, excavated earth, 2 feet minimum, more vegetation on top to hold earth in place and camouflage the shelter. Entrance. Never enter from the front or from above. Dig an entrance tunnel from the side, angling downward before curving into the main chamber. Tunnel should be small enough to block easily and positioned to prevent wind from blowing directly into the shelter. Interior features. Raised sleeping platform along one side, keeps you in the warmer air layer. Small fire pit in the center depression. Ventilation hole in the highest point of the roof. Small diameter, pluggable. Stock with emergency supplies including food, water, fuel, and blankets. Maintenance. Keep entrance tunnel clear of snow. Monitor roof for any settling or cracks. Add earth to roof as needed. Interior should stay stable once established. By February, 6 new root shelters had been constructed in the area. Several trappers built them as backup to their rebuilt cabins, following Samuel's philosophy of redundant shelter. Others built them as primary winter quarters, having lost confidence in cabin construction entirely. The technique spread beyond the immediate community. Visitors to the trading post heard the story of Samuel's survival and carried the knowledge with them. By 1882, root shelters were recognized throughout the Colorado Rockies as legitimate survival construction. Modern analysis explains why Samuel's root shelter worked so well. Ground temperature stability. Below the frost line, typically 3 to 4 feet in Colorado, ground temperature remains approximately 50 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. This temperature represents the annual average surface temperature, modulated by the Earth's thermal mass. 7 feet deep, Samuel was well below any seasonal variation. Thermal mass. The Earth surrounding Samuel's shelter represented hundreds of tons of thermal mass at stable temperature. This mass absorbed minor temperature fluctuations, preventing the rapid cooling that occurred in cabins when fires died. Insulation value. 4 feet of earth, branches, and vegetation provided approximately R20 to R25 insulation, comparable to well-insulated modern construction. This insulation prevented heat loss through the roof, the primary weakness of cabin construction. Wind protection. Underground construction eliminated wind as a factor entirely. Cabins lost enormous amounts of heat to wind infiltration through gaps in chinking, around doors and windows, and through the structure itself. Samuel's shelter had no wind exposure. Structural integrity. Earth roofs with proper support become stronger as load increases. Weight compacts the earth, making it denser and more stable. Unlike rigid cabin roofs that can fail catastrophically when load exceeds capacity, earth roofs settle gradually without catastrophic failure. Fire efficiency. The small enclosed space of Samuel's shelter required minimal heat input to maintain temperature. Body heat alone could raise temperature by 5 to 8 degrees. A small fire could raise it by 15 to 20 degrees. Cabin heating required overcoming constant heat loss through walls, roof, and gaps, making fires orders of magnitude less efficient. The efficiency calculations were dramatic. Cabin, 50-100 pounds of wood per day for 45-55 feet interior temperature root. Shelter, 3 to 5 pounds of wood per day for 55-65 degree interior temperature. Samuel achieved better comfort using 1/10 to 1/20 the fuel. In a survival situation where fuel gathering was impossible, this efficiency meant the difference between life and death. One of the most significant aspects of Samuel's story was the cultural resistance he'd faced. American and European trappers viewed underground living as primitive, animalistic, and beneath civilized men. They associated cabins with progress and technology, and holes in the ground with savagery. This attitude was deadly. The Ute, Shoshone, and other indigenous peoples of the Rocky Mountains had used underground and semi-underground shelters for thousands of years, not because they lacked the ability to build above-ground structures, but because they understood the physics of cold climate survival. Generations of trial and error had taught them that the Earth was an ally, not an enemy. European-American trappers dismissed this knowledge as primitive, preferring to import construction techniques from temperate climates that were poorly suited to Rocky Mountain winters. They built cabins because cabins were what civilized people built, not because cabins were optimal for the conditions. Samuel, having learned from Ute teachers and having survived 37 winters through adaptability, understood that survival technology should be judged by results, not by cultural associations. Underground shelter wasn't primitive, it was sophisticated, representing thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about how to live in extreme cold. The 8 men who died in the December 1879 storm were victims of cultural prejudice as much as weather. They had access to the same knowledge Samuel had. The Ute techniques were known, if not respected, throughout the trapping community. They chose to ignore that knowledge because it didn't fit their image of how civilized men should live. Samuel had no such vanity. He built what worked, lived how he had to, and survived while proud men froze in their proper cabins. Samuel Pickett continued trapping in the Colorado Rockies until 1886, when declining health finally forced him to retire. He was 68 years old, extraordinarily old for a mountain man, and had survived 44 winters in the wilderness. He credited his longevity partly to luck, partly to caution, and partly to his willingness to learn from anyone who had useful knowledge, regardless of their cultural background. The root shelter technique he taught spread throughout the Mountain West. By 1890, variations were in use from Colorado to Montana, from the Cascades to the Sierra Nevada. The basic principles remained consistent: use earth temperature for baseline warmth, insulate heavily from above, create small enclosed spaces that require minimal heating, position entrances to prevent wind infiltration. The 1879 storm remained legendary in Rocky Mountain history. Old-timers told stories of the devastation for decades, the collapsed cabins, the frozen bodies, the unprecedented snow depths, and they told stories of Samuel Pickett, the old trapper who survived in a hole under a fallen tree while everyone else died in their civilized cabins. Samuel died in 1891, at age 73, in a small cabin in Denver where he'd retired. His obituary in the Rocky Mountain News mentioned his long career as a trapper and his survival of the Great Storm of '79. It didn't mention his underground shelter. That detail had faded from public memory, preserved only in the oral tradition of the remaining mountain men. But the technique survived. Root shelters, earth lodges, and survival burrows became standard knowledge among serious wilderness travelers. The U.S. Army adopted similar techniques for winter survival training. Modern survival instructors teach variations of the same principles Samuel learned from the Ute in 1851. The morning after the search party found him, Samuel led them to James Harlan's destroyed cabin. They stood in the snow, looking at the wreckage that had killed a man who'd laughed at Samuel's dirt burrow. "Harlan was a good man," Samuel said. "Knew these mountains, knew trapping, should have survived." "Why didn't he?" one of the rescuers asked. "Because he thought he knew better than people who'd lived here for thousands of years. Because he thought cabin meant civilized and underground meant savage. Because he'd rather die comfortable in his beliefs than live uncomfortable in truth." Samuel looked at the collapsed structure, the tons of snow pressing down on what had been a home. "I tried to tell him, showed him my shelter, explained the physics. He laughed, called me crazy, called me old, called me animal, said living men build cabins. Now he's dead in his cabin, and I'm alive in my burrow." He turned to face the search party. "Learn from this. Learn that survival doesn't care about your pride. Learn that old knowledge isn't primitive. It's proven. Learn that the earth can protect you if you let it. Build your cabins if you want, but build backup too. Build something that can't fail, something that uses the earth instead of fighting it." One of the rescuers, a young man new to the mountains, asked, "What if we'd built root shelters and they'd failed? What if your method was wrong?" Samuel smiled slightly. "Then I'd be dead, and you'd be right. That's how the mountains work. They don't care who's right. They just kill whoever's wrong. I've been doing this 37 years. I've been right more than I've been wrong. That's why I'm still here." He gestured at the destroyed cabin, at the white landscape, at the mountain peaks gleaming in cold sunlight. 8 men were wrong this time. 8 men trusted cabins that couldn't hold. 8 men laughed at the old man's dirt hole. Now they're frozen, and I'm drinking coffee. That's not luck. That's not accident. That's knowing how to survive in a place that wants you dead. The search party was silent. There was nothing to say. The evidence was buried in the snow around them. 8 bodies, 8 failed shelters, 8 men who'd followed tradition instead of adaptation. And there was Samuel, 61 years old, alive and warm, having survived in a hole beneath a fallen tree because he'd learned that sometimes the primitive way is the only way that works. Samuel's root shelter remained usable for years after the 1879 storm. Other trappers maintained it as an emergency refuge, restocking supplies each autumn and clearing the entrance each spring. It became known simply as Pickett's Hole, or the Hidden Shelter, a landmark in the trapping community, a place where any man in trouble could find protection. The shelter finally collapsed in 1923, when the root ball that had formed its core finally rotted away. The debris was left where it fell. Today, the site is somewhere in the Colorado high country. Exact location lost to history, likely buried under decades of accumulated forest debris. But the knowledge Samuel preserved and spread didn't collapse. It survived in the minds of everyone he taught, passed down through generations of wilderness travelers, eventually formalized in survival manuals and military training. The principle is simple. The earth is warmer than the air in winter. If you can put earth between yourself and the sky, you have shelter. If you can dig below the frost line, you have warmth. If you can create a small space that holds heat, you can survive with minimal fuel. The technique works because it's based on physics, not culture. And physics doesn't care whether you're civilized or savage, proud or humble, comfortable or desperate. Everyone mocked Samuel Pickett's hidden tree root shelter. They called it a dirt burrow, a grave, something for animals. They knew that proper men built proper cabins with proper fireplaces. Then the storm came. The proper cabins collapsed. The proper men froze. And the old trapper in his dirt hole survived because he'd learned that survival doesn't care about proper, only about effective. His shelter was hidden in plain sight, invisible to men who couldn't imagine living underground. His knowledge was hidden in plain sight, available to anyone willing to learn from indigenous teachers. His survival was hidden in plain sight, requiring only the humility to admit that sometimes the old ways are the best ways. The mountains don't reward pride. They don't reward tradition. They don't reward civilization or propriety or doing things the way they've always been done. They reward adaptation. They reward learning. They reward building what works instead of what looks right. Samuel Pickett understood that. 8 dead men didn't, and that's the difference between surviving in the wilderness and dying in it.